Welcome to The Real Life Buyer. In this podcast, you will discover interviews with procurement and technical experts, business owners, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders. These experts will help you to develop and grow, accelerate your career, improve your business, save money, and buy smart. Now introducing The Real Life Buyer, Dave Barr.
Hello and welcome to The Real Life Buyer. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to Rob Harrison, a director at Ethical Consumer for over 33 years and author of the Handbook of Ethical Purchasing. Now, ethical purchasing is becoming extremely important to consumers, businesses, and politicians alike. And recent events such as COP26 brings attention to environmental aspects that are a subset of the ethical purchasing genre for all professional purchasers. I'm very keen to discuss ethical purchasing with Rob and discover the latest thinking and knowledge available that fellow professionals may absorb and apply in their daily strategic thinking and actions. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Rob onto the podcast. Hello, Rob.
Hi, Dave. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Absolutely welcome. Really looking forward to this. So let's just start by asking you to explain to the listeners that may not be familiar with yourself. Can you share a little bit about your professional background and the reason why you have written this book at this time?
Okay, so I started out really as a student activist looking at environmental issues and social issues, much as students still are these days, nearly 30 years ago now. And during the campaigning that we were involved in, we were really surprised at how effective campaigning in markets was. By engaging companies and sometimes big purchasers around impact. Kind of very particular example was we were involved in campaigning against CFCs in aerosols. Now, people who are very old may remember that. CFCs are still a bit of an issue, but they were in a lot of ordinary consumer goods at that time. And it was a very, very swift resolution in the UK, particularly around that, over, in a sense, naming and shaming companies that weren't running for the exit at that time. And so we began to kind of discuss, and there were also some big victories around animal testing at that time. And so we began to study it. We had a little group that set off to study it. And in order to fund the study, we thought, oh, no, let's launch a magazine called Ethical Consumer that's a guide for consumers. And I guess we didn't have enough money for more than one issue. So we thought it might last for about, 3 months or something. But 5,000 of the great British public subscribed in the first 6 months. So we got a lot of checks through the door of our flat, and we had to set up a magazine and learn how to do publishing. and we're still here doing that a long time later. And during the course of that, I guess we've learned now how to work with bigger institutions, sometimes with governments, sometimes with big companies, sometimes with small companies, around how to use markets to achieve good things, as well as just getting decent products in front of people. We found that it is really possible to to have kind of social change, positive action while you're doing all that at the same time. So and kind of it's taken me all around the world. People in Japan are fascinated by it. People in South America also do it. So there isn't a part of the world that we haven't found an interest in ethical purchasing. It seems to kind of resonate with people wherever you go. And so in a sense, I put together this book to try and share the kind of excitement that we've found in actually generating real change, real improvement to people's lives, real, decent environmental regeneration, all sorts of stuff that you can do with purchasing. We find that the subject of purchasing and procurement can be quite dry. And lots of the stuff and lots of it can be quite, if you like, formulaic or box ticksy. Like you're ticking boxes to do stuff, particularly around social issues. And I think what I'm trying to do with this is get people kind of excited about the potential for driving, really interesting things into the world and create really good change with it, just by kind of approaching it in a slightly different way. So that's the aim, to make it exciting.
Excellent. Okay. Now I've got to ask a couple of questions here because I have a Facebook group called the Purchasing and Supply Chain Community Hub, and I alerted these guys and ladies actually to the fact that we're going to have this podcast. And I asked her, what kind of questions would they like to hear the answers to? Now, the first one is from Frederick Axelson, and he asks, what is ethical procurement actually?
So ethical procurement is something that you can observe going on, and we kind of define it as when a buyer takes into an account an ethical issue as well as price and quality. So it's not like you're not looking at price and quality. Everyone's got to do that, but it's looking at a third thing as well. And, if that third thing is what we would call ethical, then we'd call it ethical procurement, if you like, or ethical purchasing. Sometimes, and usually ethical involves kind of thinking about what the impact of a decision is on someone else other than your own organization or your own project or yourself. So it's about thinking about wider impacts of choices. Often is a good definition. But, sometimes people think of ethical purchasing as just looking at human rights in the supply chain, but we use it as like an umbrella term to look at sustainable procurement, sustainable supply chain management, green public procurement. There's lots of language in this space, but we've used kind of ethical purchasing as a big umbrella term to sit above it all and group it all into one place. And I guess, although we say that ethics there are lots of things that are ethical, they tend to group into environmental issues, human rights issues, animal issues often, and then other issues. Those are the four big groups that we look at. So mainly to do with humans and environment.
Okay, fantastic. And the second question I had going to bring in is Andrew Horsfield. And he asks, do companies fully undertake ethical purchasing or just when it suits them? What's your experience?
Well, I guess it is super wide, across, we look at companies all around the world. Some companies do it really well. Some companies are great. Other companies are terrible, and often, will sometimes get caught out and pilloried in the press for doing so. And then a lot of other companies try, but I find they kind of quite often lose their way. And kind of it's quite easy to lose sight of why you're doing it. And so there's a huge variation between really good, really terrible, and companies that are trying, but often it's driven by individuals who are quite conscience-led inside the organisations, and you can see them. And then when they go and move on, you can see the impact of what someone who's really motivated inside an organisation can do. So it's often to do with the humans inside.
Yeah, it's just something just occurred to me as a quick thought. Do you tend to notice that businesses that come from certain countries are more biased towards an ethical purchasing idea and thought process than perhaps other countries? Is there any sway more towards one country than another, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to it's just dangerous to go and stereotype. How countries behave. But I think there are certain issues. You can say for example I think it was genetic modification is really big in Germany, but they don't care about it in the States. So often some issues are very big in one country and don't surface at all. In Japan, they're very into environmental impact and tracing that, but kind of less engaged perhaps with animal stuff. So there's a lot of there's cultural difference. But by and large, in terms of where you see it practiced more, I guess it depends a little bit on whether you've either got drivers from government, which are kind of forcing people to report on their I've forgotten the word now. Modern slavery can drive people to think about that, or it's got a lively civil society full of groups like campaign, like Greenpeace, kind of gluing themselves to your front door and on Monday morning, this kind of stuff. So it's about the environment around it, how well it drives.
Yeah. Okay, so let's think about your book. You can talk us through this now. So you published this around about October time, I believe. It'd be great if you could walk through an overview of the book's kind of structure and the impact you're looking for as a result of purchasing professionals reading it.
Okay, so it's a book with 10 chapters, and in a sense, most of the chapters are kind of designed for a specific type of organization. So there's a chapter for big companies, a chapter for little companies, there's a chapter for charities and social enterprises, there's a chapter for governments, a chapter for local authorities as buyers. There's a chapter even on selling to ethical purchasers, because it's kind of an important part of the same discourse. And there's a chapter for around campaigners and consumers and how they're involved in the whole big story. So the chapters are kind of set up for different audiences, but there's something about looking at them all together, because you can see the common themes that work across all of those and, in a sense, make ethical purchasing effective and kind of generate the change that you want. But by and large, it's to try and give people who are wanting to engage with it the sense that they're kind of part of something bigger and part of a kind of movement of people who are all trying to kind of get this stuff right at the same time. Because sometimes you can feel a bit isolated and wonder why you're doing all this stuff. But I think if you kind of get a sense of it going on in lots of other places at the same time, you can kind of see how and I'm trying to demonstrate, if you like, how impactful it can be and get people excited by giving kind of real world examples of good effects that have happened.
Okay, so you're covering all those different areas in the chapters. Did you need to get a lot of input, therefore, from people that are specifically working in those locations, those types of businesses, etc.? How did you manage to gather the information together that padded out the book?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I partly because we sit inside an organisation called Ethical Consumer. Every time someone does something in this space, we get a load of press releases. So
right.
So in a sense, we're kind of able to filter lots of stuff that comes through the news desk with people kind of doing new innovations, but also. We kind of work with companies as well, so we learn it on the go. Actually, yeah. we do some supply chain auditing, so we get a sense of social auditing in supply chains is like. We do strategic advice as well. So it's and with governments too. So we've been privileged in a way to work with all sorts of really super interesting organisations.
Yeah, I think that's really important to get across, that this is hands-on information and research. It's not theoretical, it's not been dreamt up, it's not your sole ideas, it's the fact that you've actually got your hands dirty, and this is the reality of the things you're finding out, which I think is really important to emphasize.
Yeah, no, I know. It's full of stories about how it doesn't always go right, and there's all sorts of kind of there's problems along the way and complexity, and people really struggle because it can be really difficult. But ultimately, when done well, it can be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's look at a couple of areas. So there's so many factors, as you mentioned already in a conversation. So let's first consider, let's say, the material aspects. So we're all aware of the blight of plastic. Everybody sees the social media posts about the amount of plastic that's going into our oceans, as an example, and the impact it's having on our planet. And therefore, the difficulty in managing and recycling it is also something that comes out. Now, what do you see as the other priority materials that we should be considering, and why?
Yeah, I mean, it's super hard because I think you can apply ethics to pretty much you can ask ethical questions of pretty much any material. I'd say the big ones from this year in 2021 is probably agricultural products like palm and soya, and the kind of and the deforestation that has been occurring as a result of those supply chains really exploding, being so successful. And I think we saw at COP26 only a few weeks ago now, that was kind of one of the few significant good things that came out of COP, was actually a realization that kind of forests and land use, the forest loss and the land use changes were really critical, and so there's a big international agreement there. But there's masses of activity within industry groups actually to try and get a handle on that. And we're seeing, particularly in food supply chains in the UK, people are really trying to get a handle on it. Not least because campaigners are getting annoyed about it as well. Yeah. So I'd say, so that one, food, those kind of agricultural supply chains are looking really big, particularly because of carbon. I mean, they've always been a worry in a way, the way land use forces people off their land and the way that land ownership works, but very specifically, the carbon impacts of it have become really front of mind this year.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thought, because some people would think, okay, you take away the forest, but you plant other crops, should we say, or other things to grow in that area. It's not just literally going to put tarmac down and start building. But just because you plant other things in the same area, then there isn't an equivalent like for like, is it? You're saying about palm oil and such. So one tree, or should we say, isn't equivalent to another tree that you've just taken down. So I just want to understand that a little bit more. It's not just a case of, you're replacing things with innate objects, or you're using cattle instead on that same land. It's not a one-for-one swap by just planting something different in the same location.
No, that's right. I mean, there is something kind of very special about forests and their ability to absorb carbon, on a much higher level than if you like ordinary savanna or grass and this kind of stuff, and all the other benefits that come from. So there's a real understanding this year of those issues.
Yeah. Okay. The other hot topic, obviously we see regularly in the news as well, is the environmental impact of international movement of not just people. We all see the planes not flying quite so readily at the moment, but also goods around the planet, and obviously the subsequent carbon footprint that generates. So can you put in some kind of context, the impact the different movement methods have on the environment, and what you see as the latest thinking emerging from the transportation industry and the demands of their customers?
Yeah, okay. I mean, we've just done a big climate report, Ethical Consumer. This is not selling the book, but it's about, and kind of globally, we know that sort of transport is roughly kind of about 25% of all emissions, moving stuff around. And of that, about 40% is cars, about 24 is flight. So about 33, about a third of all transport emissions. So about 8% of all global emissions is just shifting stuff around in supply chains. And of that, about a third is HGVs, a third is the vans, and about a third is the shipping. And and so pretty much I guess the takeaway that we've got from that is that people are really just trying to move very quickly to decarbonize those sectors. And so, they're looking at using particularly hydrogen is potential for shipping and in aviation, and certainly electricity for vans, we know, and we're not quite sure about HGVs. They're a bit heavy for batteries and all that stuff. So people are working really, really hard on trying to basically decarbonize moving stuff around, and that certainly is the right solution. And as buyers, we're aware of people using their supply chains to try and reward, companies that are doing more there. That the shipping companies are beginning to get their own house in order and their own corporate responsibility programs together. So kind of, our advice is kind of support decarbonisation and try not to get distracted by offset. There's quite a lot of offsetting in that sector. Oh no, that's fine. We're just offsetting it all. And in a sense, that's kind of not a good long-term solution, and we need to be looking at proper decarbonisation, I guess.
Yeah. So, just so people have an understanding, generally buyers will tend to think that if they're shipping things by sea, that's more environmentally friendly than obviously putting things onto a plane. So is there a way of trying to distinguish the different types? Can you scale them and say, well, the worst you can possibly do is put things onto an aircraft, and the best thing you could possibly do is this? Is there any kind of measurement method for those sort of things?
Yeah, there is actually. I don't have it to hand, but I mean, we know that. I mean, it's certainly, we've studied it a lot for ordinary consumers, and long haul flights are far and away the biggest impact that most people will have during their average life, in the kind of average year, and so flying is really kind of trying not to air freight stuff is super important.
Yeah,
the masses can be achieved there, but still there does need to be stuff done with shipping. It doesn't half get through the old diesel.
Right. Yeah. And because people are not traveling so much, I don't think everybody realizes how much of the freight beneath them isn't suitcases. Quite a lot of the freight when people travel beneath them is actually business goods being moved. So some I know will argue, well, hold on a minute, if that plane would fly anyway carrying people and there's space underneath, then we'll fill it with commercial freight. That isn't strictly correct then, is Is that the case, or what do you think?
I mean, I think still, if you kind of, if you divide the all the carbon that was burned by the weight of everyone, people and all the suitcases and all the goods across, it's really a carbon intensive way of shifting stuff around.
Yeah.
So although it's a mass transit system, it's still by far and away the biggest impact one, and kind of it's great to avoid, particularly in the next 10 years when there's pressure to get it down. Maybe later on we can go back to flying, a bit more like we did, but it's in a bit of a mess at the minute.
Yeah. Okay. So there can be times when I see things that I refer to as an ethical collision, whereby doing one ethical thing may create another ethical issue elsewhere. So if we take, for example, the migration to the use of electric vehicles, we can see such impacts as the need for the installation of infrastructure to support that requirement. Everyone needs to charge their vehicles across the country, and therefore everybody needs a charging point. It frequently all in different places. When you're mining the materials such as the cobalt, there may be an environmental impact because it could be mined literally. So open cast, it could be quite devastating, and there's quite often modern slavery impacts. And of course, there's the challenge of recycling batteries, particularly the older technology rather than the newer technology. I know there's lots working on that. So what does the most recent research show as to how people and business can wrangle with these different conflicts and therefore make informed decisions for long-term positive impact?
Yeah, no. It's an example that kind of anyone who thinks about ethical purchasing comes across. We have it with consumers write to us all the time and go, should I buy an organic carrot from Germany or a non-organic one from the farm next door? What's the most environmental thing to do? And by and large, what we advise is that you can't come to a solution. Maths or science can't come to a solution when you're comparing different impacts. If you're going to pollute something with one choice and save carbon with another choice, in a sense, you have to make a decision as to which is the most important thing to deal with first. So in a sense, it's about coming to an agreement about what the kind of social or the political priorities for the business are. And at the moment, carbon is winning quite a lot of those arguments because everyone's really scared about climate change at the moment.
Yeah.
But not, and in a sense, I think that's kind of the majority opinion around electric cars. Certainly, everyone goes, it's far from ideal, those supply chains, and it's far, and it's going to require masses of manufacture of new infrastructure. But even when you add all that stuff together, the impact on carbon is so significant that it's worth putting up with that for a bit, and then you can kind of fix those things later. And I think, and because it's about making what are kind of social or ethical political choices between prioritizing one thing or another, lots of businesses to give themselves. I mean, if they're not just owned by one guy who thinks, I can make the choice myself, if they're big, often they're big collaborative efforts of business, and they will do stakeholder consultation effectively in order to do this, and they can involve their customers or their even their investors and all this kind of stuff on how to resolve those things, because that's the only way. It is effectively a political choice, and it's best to try and get as many people on the right side when you make those kind of choices.
Yeah, okay. So from a kind of business perspective, we need or wish to set goals and targets so you can drive action and behaviors, hopefully in the correct direction. We also see benchmark best-in-class role models to evaluate ourselves against. So what comprehensive ethical models do you see being used to determine consistent measurement of ethical purchasing in commercial applications?
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter in the book on what we call on what we've called ethical labeling, and in a sense, it's been one of the kind of boom areas of this kind of behavior of ethical purchasing generally. And it's everything from organic and fair trade labels to the palm oil labels and all this kind of stuff. But actually what's happening with lots of the ethical labels is that companies will sometimes adopt the standards within them, and they're not that necessarily interested in using the labels as part of what they're selling. They're using them as benchmarking tools. And so this is one of the things I guess that was perhaps surprising, in the research was how often companies would sign up for this stuff, but actually not make it part of their marketing mix. And these ethical labels or standards are really kind of industry specific for particular products. There's MSC for fish, and there's FSC for timber and all this kind of stuff. So and the thing about those schemes is that they're useful for benchmarking as well, and so that's what people use for those specific ones. I mean, there are kind of slightly more broader umbrella things going on as well around generally in procurement in the UK. We've got a thing called Ethical Trading Initiative with ETI, which is concerned about workers' rights standards in the supply chain, and it uses ILO standards there to kind of help it, and it's been a government funded thing for a while. So there are those Uber things like that, and I have just when I saw your question, I actually looked it up, and I noticed that the CIPS SIPS has got a new global standard with masses of ethical purchasing stuff, and it just came out in May this year. So I shall have to give that a proper read. It wasn't there when the book went to the printers, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
so it's clearly moving fast, and there are, but they're often really industry and material specific, those standards and that kind of benchmarking.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge from our own perspective is that you have all these different things that you either know or believe, perceive what is good, bad, or indifferent. Now, when we look at foods, you mentioned some of the labels. If something says it's high in one thing and low in another thing, like fat or something like that, and sugars, then okay, that's a bad thing to eat and that's a good thing to eat. But it's very difficult to have some kind of understanding of the scale, the measure of each of these different choices. Where should I do these things first? What are the red label things to do versus the yellow label and the green label, that kind of stuff. And that, I think, can be quite confusing to people, which they do first. They just pick the easy stuff that might have minimal impact, or do they go for the harder stuff? And I think it's the same for business. What's the right thing?
Yeah, I guess, in the times when, the kind of key word is materiality, I think. And, often, and again, there are whole ways of researching the specific materiality in your business. But I think there's a way of identifying the ones that have the greatest impact in the very specific piece of business that you are. And then we often, when we work with business, we'd often say, just work on one material in your first year and try and get that right, and not try and solve, because often businesses can be hugely complicated now. They've been around for hundreds of years. They've got all sorts of really complex supply chains, and actually trying to introduce this kind of thinking and language in them is massively complicated, and you can sometimes just kind of despair at the size of it. So you really have to kind of break it up into manageable chunks. And we often, I think, certainly when human rights in clothing supply chains hit the fan, pardon the expression, they had kind of 5 year, many of the companies involved, it took them 5 years to map their supply chains to a level whereby they had some confidence about what was going on there. So people are making sense of it by breaking it up into manageable chunks. And I think by and large, your stakeholders or your consumers or your buyers and people that you're working with will understand this if you can show that it's a part of a program. I'm going to get onto that one next year, but we've really got to fix this one because it's most material. I think people can kind of understand that if it's communicated well.
Yeah. The trouble is, it's quite easy sort of when people in business see the enormity of the problem we face, to sort of kind of step back and almost fall into inaction, as the range and depth of issues we're just talking about now is so vast and complex. So there can be a mentality of, what impact can I have that will make a difference? ? So what arguments and activities are being used that you see to encourage positive action and minimize that overwhelm and kind of prevent that, let's look at it tomorrow mindset because it's just too complicated?
Yeah, the first thing what I would say is one of the things I'm trying to do with this book is kind of go, all of us as unless the very biggest companies that kind of all nearly own their suppliers, but all but the very biggest companies, we can only have so much impact with what we do on our own, But lots of these things, like the big collective labeling schemes, like organic or like the palm oil and MSC, these are effectively big global collective actions involving thousands of businesses, lots of researchers, all sorts of scientists, all sorts of people trying to get to the right. So in a sense, if you're able to align your purchasing with pre-existing projects that are trying to do it, then you know that you're part of a bigger thing that is trying to achieve the same thing. And so that can be, that in a sense is the solution to it being just what impact can I have, trying to align purchasing with some of the bigger projects that are out there. I mean, the second thing, and kind of one of the key points that I'm trying to make in the book, is that it's really important to try and track the positive impacts each year so that you can kind of see that a good thing has happened as a result of this, because it's one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, but we may well do. But the kind of the conflict between buying something cheap and getting something ethical. I mean, they aren't always juxtaposed, and it isn't always more expensive. But where it is, if you're not kind of tracking the good things that you're getting along with the ethical choices, whatever kind of, we managed to kind of regenerate this land, or these people got great jobs, and all this kind of stuff that you get from it, or we help build a school here, and all the things that fair trade does. So some of the schemes are very good at kind of sharing and measuring their collective impacts, so people get this kind of sense that something's happening. But I think that unless companies begin reporting on the positive impacts of their purchasing in the same way that they do on the profit and loss and the other stuff that they're doing, it's always going to get pushed aside when the drive to just kind of up the profits, or indeed close the losses, become important. So kind of regular measurement of the good things that are happening, because it makes people feel good, at least.
Okay. And just thinking about that, it's a good point you've touched on, cost, profit, public image comes to mind, because obviously businesses quite often, not always obviously, have shareholders. People are expecting increased profits year after year. They want to be involved in and work for a company that's got a really good public image, obviously doing what they see as the right things. So what kind of actions are you seeing being deployed that overcome the potential cost arguments? You mentioned cost just now. Don't just buy it cheap, because the overall cost of something may be much greater than the outlay that you initially see. So what are you seeing as being deployed to overcome those things and highlight the importance of reputation, perhaps more so than just purely profit?
Yeah, so amongst really big corporates with a big public image to lose, if you see what I mean, it's risk mainly, and boards are very good at risk management, and they look at all sorts of things like COVID and all the other stuff, and reputational risk from kind of supply chain errors of judgment are can be quite high, particularly if you are buying palm oil or timber, or all sorts of stuff with problem areas. So risk is kind of one of the really good things that has been kind of, if you like, used as an argument against always making as a real commercial argument, because they are real commercial risks, and there is some great evidence, or terrible, depending on which way you're looking at it, of companies really getting caught out and losing quite a lot of cash as a result of not paying attention to the risks of making poor ethical decisions in supply chains. So that's probably the biggest impactor for big companies. I'd say possibly with smaller ones where it's easier to have kind of new entrants in markets and all that kind of stuff. It's sometimes competitiveness, because there are quite a lot of younger people opening up new companies in a space who are kind of making a song and dance of how ethical they are, and they're doing this great thing, and look at all this stuff that I'm doing. So there are some business areas where that's really obvious. But tea is the classic example we use, where kind of like 80% of consumer tea brands have got some kind of ethical claim on, and this kind of stuff. So some markets are very competitive, and just trying to not look like being off the pace forces people just to think about their supply chains in an ethical way. But risk is the big one, I think, probably.
Yeah. You just mentioned there about the claims. That's always a difficult, isn't it? Because you do hear stories, whether they're right, wrong, or indifferent, about people making claims about their products and services, but do they actually measure up? Who's been honest and perhaps who's been a little bit, tongue in cheek that they're doing X, Y, and Z? Is there any way of evaluating that without pouring through board reports and websites and validating that their claims are real?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I've previously referred to the ethical labelling schemes and the certification schemes, and those have sort of evolved to answer that question. So if you get your certified FSC timber or whatever, this is, or your conflict-free minerals and all this kind of stuff. It's there. These are, if you like, schemes that try to solve that problem by going, we've had a third party go out and check, and it's all good. I mean, they actually don't always, and there's still lots of kind of stories of it going wrong inside even these certification schemes. But I think so. It's mainly those that do it. I mean, one of the interesting things that I think we've seen in the last kind of 12 to 24 months is this discourse around ethical kind of just business generally is ramping up, that government and regulators are beginning to look at this in more detail. There's been new stuff this year about ethical investments are beginning to be regulated. Claims around those are always been a bit weird, and now they're beginning to be controlled. And the CMA, Competition and Markets Authority, has began to start looking at green claims. First time it's done it. It came out this year, so it's really good and encouraging in a way to see the government just kind of going about, you can't say that, it's not true.
Yeah. So you need to do a little bit of digging and make sure that they are truly independent evaluations, basically. Unfortunately, that does mean there's not a one-stop shop to go and find out this. You've got to do, say, a bit of research, really.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So before I finish with one final question, because I'm keeping an eye on the time here, how would the listeners connect with you, find out more about Ethical Consumer, perhaps purchase a copy of your book and discover more things that you're getting involved in?
Yeah, so if you type Ethical Consumer into Google, you'll come to our website, which has got kind of most of the stuff that's going on there. I mainly work on the site. If you type in Ethical Consumer Research Hub, you'll find your way to Rob and the work that I do, which tends to be more with the academics and some of the business side over there. And there's a bit of information about the book. If you want to find out about the book, Routledge are selling the publisher, and they've got stuff on their website. It's called the Handbook of Ethical Purchasing. And again, Google will find that for you. And I kind of don't really do social media very much myself. My head is already too full to do Twitter and Facebook and all that. But Ethical Consumer have their Twitter and Facebook handles, and indeed, if I ask them to put stuff out, they'll do it for me. But I'm getting a bit old for all that.
Okay. So one final question then, before you have to shoot off. So for a business wishing to look both kind of internally and externally to develop a comprehensive ethical business strategy, whilst they engage their stakeholders, what do you see as the sort of key headlines, steps, or stages they need to review and flesh out to start?
Yeah, classically stakeholder consultation is where people begin this if they're really starting from scratch. And, if you've got loads of money and time to throw it at, there are, 7 big stakeholder groups that I don't need to tell you all about, but, they're customers, investors, suppliers, staff and all this kind of stuff. But in a sense, certainly I would involve staff. Certainly it would be crazy not to talk to customers, and, also your suppliers as well. So those are kind of critical ones, and indeed your investors if they're external, so that you'd be crazy to be trying to do strategic stuff inside a business without talking to those groups, particularly around issues like this where it's quite hard. Maths can't always, as we talked about earlier, maths can't really necessarily say that's the right answer in this particular case to do that. I mean, very, very specifically in 2022, I would say that, most businesses and indeed other, charities, universities, people that we're working with, pretty much everyone has got carbon at the top of their agenda now. And they are, people are running very, very fast to try and understand the carbon impacts of their supply chains. People are really just often just at the beginning of trying to do that. But I think in a few years' time, certainly in supply chains, knowing the carbon impacts of them and indeed having a decent plan about how to get them down in line with global targets is going to be front and center of most people's work, because that's kind of one thing that applies to pretty much every business that you're in.
Have you stumbled across any particular templates or best-in-class efforts, models, or anything that people could easily find on the internet or something that can help them sort of formulate a structure to start working with? Is there anything you can sort of share there?
Yeah, it's a really hard question, actually, because there's such a lot of difference in business, from a tiny one person in a kitchen making, artisan food for the market, to a giant multinational, doing, whatever, getting iron ore out the ground somewhere. And so the variation is super hard. But I think it's about finding something that does, if you're a tiny artisan business and you're trying to read the advice for a giant, you will it'll make no sense to you. Yeah. And in a sense, it's about finding the thing that speaks both to the industry sector that you're in, that makes it, and to the size of business that you are, because those things are super relevant to the degree to which you can afford to kind of make this, how complicated this stuff can become for you in order to make an impact. But yeah, and then, kind of looking around locally, if you're a small business, there are often, there are specialists in this place all the time. I mean, some are, as in all business, all supply chains, some are better than others. But I wouldn't say there's a single one that fits all, because the variety in business is so huge.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's fantastic. I see our time is coming to an end. So, I'd like to say thank you very much for your insights and inspiration. I certainly hope that people are inspired by the things you've got to do, and will obviously rush out and investigate the purchase of your book. So best of luck with your book for the future, Rob.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, it's been great talking to you, Dave.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, and take care.
Yeah, thank you, and goodbye.
Bye. So there's another Real Life Buyer podcast. I do hope you enjoyed it, and it's given you some ideas and inspiration for greater action and achievement. If you are a purchasing or a supply chain professional, business owner or director, come and join my Facebook group, the Purchasing and Supply Chain Community Hub, a safe place to engage with like-minded, friendly people. See you soon. Bye.